we're going to be talking about kind of the history of May Day, the history of International Workers' Day. And David has a bunch of notes written up on that. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to David. You were there, right? You were there.
I was there.
At the
Yeah.
Haymarket Massacre.
Yeah. Yeah.
In
Okay.
in 1894.
You're killing me. You're killing me. Every day it's an old man joke. That's all right. Yeah. So when we originally started talking, me and Jacob started talking about this last week. We thought, what better day to do our debut kind of inaugural live broadcast than May Day. I personally didn't work today, and I actually I don't take vacation. I don't take paid absence. I tell them I want unpaid leave for the day. I don't want to be paid today because I want to feel like I'm actually on strike. I'm walking out, and you don't owe me crap. Uh, so yeah, May Day today. Happy May Day. Um, it's celebrated in almost every, to the best of my knowledge, it's celebrated in every industrialized country in the world except for America. Every industrialized country in the world except for America, and it actually happened here. I mean, that just kind of goes to show you the mad respect that workers all over the world have given uh, organized labor for this day, and our government shorts us on it. And actually, uh, a lot of, I was talking to my daughters earlier today, and I told them we could pull over 100 people right now and ask each one of them what May Day was, and I would bet $100 to a dollar, no one would have one clue. Uh, it's unfortunate because
Yeah.
it's a very, very integral part of why we get overtime pay, why we are not working on weekends, why we get 8 hour days, 40-hour weeks, and anything over that is paid at a higher rate. So, yeah, May Day started in 1877. Uh, well, let's say this: the original call for what become May Day started in 1877 by the Working Men's Party in Chicago. They called a general strike for the 8 hour workday. Up until then, everybody was working 10. Some people were working 12 hours a day. And basically the motto was 8 hours of work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for what you will. And it's what we know today as our standard work week. Um, so they started calling for it around 1877. On July 26th in 1877, thousands of workers went on strike to support this movement. Uh, the Army with bayonets, infantry, came in. 30 strikers, including numerous children, were murdered by the police and the federal troops. During that strike, there was a guy by the name of Albert Parsons. Him and his wife will be very integral part of May Day as it moved forward. But it just kind of goes to show you why the government don't want us to recognize May the 1st as to having anything to do with labor, because the fact of the matter is they sent in police and the U.S. Army to gun down striking workers that were peacefully protesting. Uh, so basically, yeah, it caused the a movement across the United States of workers for the 8 hour day. So around 1884, the Federal Organization of Trades and Labor Unions, which was the predecessor to the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, which we've talked about in some of the earlier YouTube videos. If you want to learn more about the American Federation of Labor, go back. Jacob's got them laid out great. they began a nationwide call for the 8-hour day. And it at the time, we don't think it's a big deal now. 8 hours, it seems like a pretty fair deal, but at the time, uh, even then it wasn't a completely radical idea because the workers in Illinois and the federal workers were already supposed to have been covered by an 8-hour day. But it was in the law. It was on the books. It was just the fact that the federal government refused to enforce it. And basically, in Illinois, uh, as you see a lot today, when somebody would hire a worker, they would force them to sign, not force, but they would say, if you want to come to work for us, then you'll sign this waiver saying that we won't recognize the 8-hour day. So it's one of those, almost like a right to work is today, where they say, yeah, you're free to do whatever you want so long as you do what we tell you. And that was basically the way it was. So a lot of the workers had effectively waived their rights, even though the law was on the books.
If I could interject there, that kind of that's one among many things that, in my view, just really illustrates the lack of seriousness that kind of the libertarian conception of individual rights is. Because if you can just, if you allow just any individual to like sign away their rights, then you give the powerful like employers the ability to make that a demand for employment. And once that becomes a necessity to be employed there, then you really, really affect kind of the power relations between the employer and the employee. And we see that a lot today, where to be employed, you have to sign away your right to you have to sign an arbitration clause, which means that you will, in the event that you're sexually harassed, it's usually in relation to sexual harassment. In the event that you're sexually harassed, you don't have the right to take it to court. Like, you just sign away your right to take a manager that is that sexually harasses you to court on those charges. And the fact that that's legal is just crazy. You can say like, I should be able to sign away my right to not be sexually harassed. I don't understand the logic behind that. And that's just one in so many examples of the employer using kind of the state apparatus of contracts and individual rights, so-called, to hurt workers and to hurt working class people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it like you said, the power dynamics and the leverage. I hear a lot of people talking about, it's in right to work states especially, but non-union jobs. If you don't like the pay, go somewhere else. The problem with that whole concept is employers hold all of the leverage unless there's a strong foothold with organized labor in that area. A single individual has zero leverage in negotiating their higher-end wage, their days of vacation that they may get, and anybody that says otherwise is a flat-out liar. Because go over to any employer, non-union employer, and hire in with them and try to negotiate your wage, try to negotiate your vacation, try to negotiate a pension, and see what they tell you. They'll laugh in your face. Because the fact of the matter is, free market is absolute shit whenever you can't negotiate collectively.
Right.
You as an individual cannot do that. So, back to the Haymarket. The employers was asking the employees, the new hires, to sign away their right to an 8-hour day, which was already in the federal law. And the federal government refused to enforce it. so we got a national movement at, you know, from the 1870s into the mid 1880s. It built up. In 1865, there were 645 strikes nationwide at over 2,400 businesses in support of an 8-hour day. A lot of those was Wobblies. A lot of them was the AFL. But, you know, there was a lot of people demanding an 8-hour day. In 1886, the year of the Haymarket riot, the number of strikes had doubled to 1,400. So from 6,500 to 1,400. So there was a lot of workers out on the streets demanding an 8-hour day.
Yeah, and just to kind of put that into context, in 1886, 60,000 workers in Chicago walked off their jobs. If we remember back when CWA did their strike, 20,000 workers walked off the job across the Southeast, and that was a really big strike. You know, across Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi, Georgia, and Florida, 20,000 workers across those 5 states, and we said, this is a big strike. UAW strike last year, I forget how many workers that was. Was it
20,000 maybe?
50,000? I can't recall, but I don't even think it was 60,000. If it was 60,000, it was right around 60,000, and that was across the whole United States. And that was the biggest single strike in what, decades?
Yeah.
And
you can take into consideration the population now versus the population, you know, 150 years
exactly ago. How many, you know, how big of the population in Chicago, that's just one city in one state, had to have been on strike. With 60,000 people in 1886, you know, that's, I can't imagine that, you know, like how many people would we have to see on the streets in Huntsville? Just Huntsville, that's like a middling city. How many people would we have to see on the streets to match the kind of per capita striking versus non-striking worker? I can't imagine, it's crazy.
Yeah, well, if you go back, there's some pictures of that time and drawings and what have you, and you go back and look, and it's insane the amount of people out in the street. So it was there was a heck of a movement anyway, and for good reason. I mean, that 8-hour day, you know, that we take for granted now. Man, I can't imagine. I've had to work some 10-hour days, and whew, I'll tell you what. I can't imagine doing it every day, which those folks back then was a lot stronger than we are today. They got a little bit more backbone, but, you know, so yeah, 2 of the biggest organizers for what we call the Haymarket Affair, or the Haymarket Riots, as the government likes to call them, and as schools will refer to them as, was Lucy and Albert Parsons. And we talked about Albert earlier on, but, you know, this kind of brings into the fold how important women were during that time, and how important women are and have been to the labor movement in general. And I think a lot of times, you know, when you say unions and you see the skulls on people's shirts and things like that, everybody kind of ignores the female aspect of organized labor. But man, women have been an integral part of organized labor from the beginning, and still are today. I got some of the strongest union women in my shop that, you know, that you could ever ask for. But so yeah, Lucy and Albert Parsons. Lucy had been born a slave in Texas. She was African American, Native American, and Mexican. And prior to that, she had worked for the Freedmen's Bureau immediately after the Civil War. She married Albert, and they moved to Chicago, where she began writing and organizing women in the sewing industry, which is you know, a big tremendous. Also on down the line, the textile workers put on a tremendous strike. But and Albert was a printer, or what they called back then a typesetter. You know, basically he set up the lettering in the old school printers. He was also a Knights of Labor, which we talked about early on, which was one of the early labor federations, one of the first ones in America. And he was the editor of a labor paper called The Alarm. Also one of the founders of the Chicago Trades and Labor Assembly. So this whole time we're building up to the general strike for the 8-hour day. And it accumulated on Monday, May the 3rd. On the afternoon of May the 3rd, a gentleman by the name of August Spies was addressing a rally of striking workers that had been locked out of the McCormick Reaper Works in Chicago. And this is basically where the entire Haymarket affair took place. Hundreds of police officers arrived and, just begun shooting into the crowd. No, unprovoked, completely peaceful demonstration, start shooting into the crowd and executing people. Several workers died. I don't know how many were wounded. The details are few from back then. And, you talked when early on when we discussed labor in general, and we talked about what they were teaching in school. You talked about even then you didn't learn a whole lot about the Haymarket affair, and that's kind of points to the fact that very few textbooks actually provide a thorough explanation of exactly what happened. And they very rarely ever mention that the mayor of Chicago had actually given his permission or granted this meeting that all of the police showed up and started executing workers at. And that kind of goes back to the fact of why the IWW does not allow police in their union, because police, in effect, are, and no disrespect to policemen out there, there's a lot of them that do great work, but they're there to protect the interests of business. Simple as that. So very few textbooks that kids learn in school nowadays goes into the details of all that. So during this May 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, there was accumulation of speakers. It was basically kind of like what we would do today, or like Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. King would do in the past. He would put on 2 or 3 day conferences, try to bring people out and educate them on the social and economic justice, the injustices that are happening. After that Monday, as anyone can imagine, several of the speakers failed to appear. Most of the speakers just would not speak, because who wants to stand up before a crowd and take a chance of the police coming in again? Right. So instead of starting at 7:30, the meeting was delayed for about an hour. I'm sure they were trying to figure out what in the world they're going to do. The police executed people yesterday. We're not going to get the turnout. We don't have the speakers. Instead of the expected 20,000 people, they had less than 2,500 to attend. 2 substitute speakers came over to the square at the last minute. They have been attending a meeting of the sewing workers organized by, Lucy Parsons, of course, and her fellow organizer, Lizzie Holmes. There was last minute speakers. The last minute speakers were Albert Parsons, her husband, which them two had kind of organized it. He had just returned from Ohio, and Samuel Fielden, an English-born Methodist lay preacher who worked in the labor movement. And, up until probably the last 20 years, most of your preachers, evangelists and things like that were very, very active in the labor movement, because they recognized the same thing that, the Bible taught, and most of their parishioners, or the people that attended their church, were average working people, and they were out there supporting them. You don't see that a whole lot anymore, unfortunately. So the demonstration in the Haymarket Square in that afternoon on Tuesday, May the 4th, was peaceful. As you can imagine, I mean, the police just come in and executed a bunch of people. The ones that did show up are definitely not going to stir up any ruckus. But they were listening to Albert Parsons and the Methodist pastor Samuel Fielden speak, and he spoke. Parsons spoke to the group and then left the rally to meet his family at a nearby labor hall. Spies spoke at the rally as well, urging peaceful action to protest the massacre of the previous day and to support the cause of the 8-hour day. You know, coincidentally, the Chicago mayor that had approved the entire rallies, he was actually in attendance. And, you know, he told the police the demonstration was tame and peaceful.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it was so they had gotten the late start. They had threw together a few speakers. The rally was almost over, and there was about 200 people remained when 176 policemen carrying Winchester rifles came in. Fielden was speaking. That was the Methodist pastor, and Lucy and Albert Parsons had left because it was beginning to rain. At that point, when the policemen came in, somebody in the crowd had made a dynamite bomb and threw it into the police lineup with all the police. I don't know that I blame him. You know, I've thought about this numerous times, and I'm thinking, just the day before the police had came in and began executing people, and I'm sitting there thinking, in a free society, do you not have the right to protect yourself? And when 176 police come back with Winchester repeating rifles, which is basically the automatic weapon of the time, I don't know that I blame the guy, but whoever done it, go ahead.
And I think that there's even some question as to whether it was somebody, you know, that was actually of the crowd, or whether it was like a Pinkerton plant or something.
Yeah, no, I mean, nobody was ever able to prove anything.
Right.
So yeah, it very well could have been a Pinkerton trying to incite more riots, and because at the end of the day, the businesses do not want the 8-hour workdays.
No.
Regardless, even if it was, I believe the guy had the right to protect himself, whoever it was. I mean, that's one of the founding principles, you know.
Well, that's why conservatives say that we have to have the Second Amendment, and they ought to be able to own machine guns and bazookas if they want, because they're supposed to be able to shoot the government if they, you know.
Yeah.
That's the whole reason that they. So, you know, that may be a controversial sentiment, saying that. You know, I don't know if I blame the guy for throwing a bomb into a bunch of police, but like, that's the whole, you know, the people that would be mad at that are also the people who say that I have to have a gun so that I can go and shoot the military if they ever come and try to bring me out of my house or something, you know. So it's not, it's a totally reasonable reaction, I think, even if some folks might, you know, think it's controversial.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it is controversial, but you know, history shows us that authoritarian figures have really well down on working class people throughout the history of time. So if it's controversial, so be it.
Right.
I kind of feel like we should have the right to protect ourselves. But anyways, the bomb was tossed. At that point, as you can imagine, police started gunning people down once again. They panicked. It was dark. It was raining. A lot of 7 policemen died, which coincidentally was shot by their own policemen, because they were just waylaying with these Remington Winchester repeater rifles. 4 workers were killed, and very few textbooks ever bother to mention any of this. So the next day, martial law was declared, not just in Chicago, martial law throughout the entire United States because, of course, while this was taking place in Chicago, they had a lot of support across the nation. Anti-labor governments around the world use Chicago incident to crush labor union movements. In Chicago, and I'm certain across the United States as well, labor leaders were rounded up. Houses were entered without search warrants. Union newspapers were closed down. You know, it was basically the Red Scare all over, or the beginning of what we would know as the McCarthyism era, or some of us would know, some of the older folks. Eventually, 8 men were brought to trial, representing a cross section of the labor movement. Among them were Fielden, Parsons, and a young carpenter named Louis Ling, who was accused of throwing the bomb, even though Ling had witnesses to prove that he was over a mile away at the time. And that, you know, those at the time they were calling them eight Chicago anarchists. I don't know that they were anarchists. Maybe they were anarcho-syndicalists. But Michael Schwab was one of them. Samuel Fielden was one of them. George Engel, Adolf Fischer, and Oscar Neebe was another one. The indictment acknowledged that the bomb had been thrown by an unknown person, but alleged that the unknown bomb thrower had been aided and abetted and encouraged by these 8 folks and by the labor movement in general, truth be known. All 8 of the defendants were tried and convicted. 7 were sentenced to death. Fielden and Schwab later had their sentences commuted to life imprisonment. And they say that Ling died on the eve of his scheduled execution, but you know, it's very strange because they also said that his face was half blown off by a dynamite cap, and you kind of got to wonder how in the world you get a dynamite cap into a jail. So a lot of people speculate that he was actually assassinated because he was supposed to be pardoned the following day. So I think truthfully the police were probably pissed, and they come into a cell and figured they would take some vigilante justice on him.
Right, and I think I think it's worth noting that the jury was stacked with business owners in the community. It was the sister of a policeman who had been killed, I think, or the brother of a policeman who had been killed, and clerks of judges that were really close to these business owners. I mean, the jury was completely stacked, and the prosecutor had said things in the trial like, when you indict these men, you're not indicting these men, you're indicting the violent, the violent movement that they represent, basically. And that was forbidden from the defense couldn't enter that into evidence for the defense of the people. I mean, it was a completely, it's worth emphasizing how much this was a sham trial. This was not, this was not justice being carried out, and we're just, just because we liked them throwing the bomb at the cops, like that we're saying that it was like, you can go and look and see what the prosecutor said, see who was on the jury, see who the judge was, and that's all it's a completely stacked trial. There was no way that any fair jury would have convicted these 8 men of the crimes that they were charged with. It was absurd.
Yeah. Well, and even if you go back to the indictment that was drawn up, which is basically the argument by the state to prosecute these people, even the initial indictment said that the, the, the dynamite had been thrown by an unknown person. I mean, at the end of the day, in today's world, if you can't put somebody, in the position of committing the crime, you know, you can't prosecute. You can't find them guilty. But back then, they had a little bit different idea of justice.
Right.
And also, it's worth noting that the Chicago Tribune offered to pay money to the jury if it found the 8 men guilty. So not only was the indictment crap, the jury was stacked. The Chicago Tribune come out and said, "We'll pay you if you'll find them guilty." I don't know. I don't know what in what person's world that is called justice, but
right.
So yeah, and I guess it's worth noting that the final gesture of retribution, that the ropes that were used to execute the prisoners were made so short that instead of dying, because when the trap door drops, the rope's supposed to be long enough that it gives your body enough time to get up to speed, so it snaps your neck and it kills you fairly instantly. The executioners have made the rope so short that when the trap door dropped, it wouldn't snap their neck, and they would sit there and die, suffer of suffocation, instead of a quick, painless death. What we would think would be a painless death. And so, I guess we can wrap it up by saying the real issue is the same issues that the Constitution was written, was based on, was the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to free assembly, the right to fair trial by a jury of peers, and the right of workers to organize and fight for things like the 8-hour day. Everything
right.
that we supposedly stand for.
Exactly. That's the thing that so many people miss about freedom of speech. They think that these enlightened liberals, not in the contemporary 21st century, a liberal is a left-wing person and a conservative is a right-wing person, but a liberal is in somebody who, upholds values of individual rights and freedom of speech, and all these people. And so in that definition, the founders were all liberals of some sort. People think that these enlightened liberals wrote down on a piece of paper the Constitution, and that act, from it flowed forth freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, and that, for most of the country's history, that was just a piece of paper that did not mean jack squat to the majority of people in this country. It meant nothing. Absolutely nothing. Even if don't talk about slavery, which is, a huge deal, just this. There were people that were well within their rights, organizing peacefully. The only time that somebody may have violently retaliated was in self-defense. They were organizing peacefully, not hurting anybody, for their rights, for better working conditions, something that anybody would say today is constitutionally protected. And they were murdered, they were slaughtered, they were massacred, they were put through a sham trial and indicted and convicted and executed. It's when union folks, when people in the labor movement say people died to give you the 8-hour workday, people died to give you paid leave, people died to give you the weekend, like, this is what we're talking about. It's not the people from the Revolutionary War, or the people or Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, who helped to write the Constitution. They're, for the most part, just non-consequential as far as what the freedoms that you have that you enjoy on a day-to-day basis, you have that because of the labor movement. You have that because these mass movements of workers, even the things that you could construe as individual rights, like freedom of speech, let's say, that's a very individual kind of right. That was not won by a movement based around a liberal version of individual rights. That was won by movements led by radicals, led by socialists and anarchists and communists for the rights of the working class as a class of people. It's so important that people know the real origins of the things that they take for granted every day. Every day when you clock out at 8 o'clock, like, think a radical, think a leftist. That didn't happen because of a conservative libertarian movement for individual rights. It
didn't happen from the founding fathers. It didn't. The founding fathers wrote the document, but it was completely ignored until the labor movement began fighting for it and began sacrificing their lives for it.
Right. That's exactly right. Like what Martin Luther King Jr. said, we're not asking this country, they weren't asking this country to be anything better than what they said they would be. Yeah. Right? We're just holding you to the promises that you wrote on paper, is what he said. And for most of the country's history, and in the case of many freedoms for many people, still to this day, they're just words on a piece of paper. And the labor movement has historically and today fights to make those words a reality for people, for working people, for families.
For the lesser among us.
Right. And that's another thing, is you mentioned earlier, one of the people that spoke at Haymarket, he was a minister, and you mentioned how integral kind of Christianity and the labor movement were through a lot of its history. I'm a federal employee. I'm a member of the American Federation of Government Employees. My national president was a Baptist minister, and he said that he felt called to that the labor movement, that God told him the labor movement was his ministry, and that's where God wanted him. And I'm not going to pretend to be some devout Christian or tell you how to interpret your Bible, but I mean, man, if there's another movement that is fighting for the least of these more than the labor movement, and more than the labor movement has historically, like, I want to meet those folks. They must be pretty great. Why haven't I heard about them?
Yeah, the labor movement encompasses so much that it's the reason that we are here right now, because at the end of the day, there is no other movement on earth. You can talk about conservative, liberal, Republican, Democrat, libertarian. I don't really care what you term yourself as. The most important thing that you can do is join in the labor movement, because they're fighting for all of the rights that both sides claim to be fighting for, but they're actually coming together as a group. A lot of and it really speaks to the unity that the labor movement brings together, because in Red State, Alabama, I work alongside some of the most conservative, some of the most libertarian, Republican folks that you would ever lay your eyes on, but they believe in the labor movement because of the Civil Rights Act, because of the fact that the women at my plant make the exact same wage that a man makes working side by side. The fact that we refuse to allow anyone to be discriminated against based on their age, their sex, their religion, their sexual preference, things like that. All of these things that everybody constantly talks about, we actually make happen. We and the fact of the matter is, the labor movement were the ones that fought for the Civil Rights Act, for all of these things that we take for granted, the 8-hour day, the child labor laws. I mean, I said it earlier in the week. There's a lot of people that would say that unions are not needed any longer. But the fact of the matter is, if somebody's not fighting for them, fighting for the rights of the common man, we're going to lose them, because they're the government. And I don't care what flavor of government you enjoy, whether it be the left side of the government aisle or the right side of the government aisle. Both sides are doing everything they can to take everything away from you that they can possibly take away. And I don't care what you say, whether you're a Democrat and you're 100% supportive of Democrats, they've screwed us time and time again, or whether you're a Republican and you're 100% supportive of Republicans, they've screwed us time and time again. And at some point, people are going to realize to give up on the political system in general and start fighting at the worker level. Because when we begin demanding what we want, there's more of us than them, and we'll get what we want.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Basically, anything good that the American government has ever done has been done it's been made to do that by movements of workers. It's not any political party that was particularly good at the time or anything like that. Even the politicians that I most like, the things that I most like that they did, they were forced to do those things by a organized and powerful labor movement.
Yeah. And so long as we've got this conflict between left versus right, the one thing that I can promise you that will happen is when all the workers get together and demand that this is what they want, it don't matter whether you're on the left or whether you're on the right, you are going to do it. They will kneel to the workers' request when everybody says this is what we want.
Right. And so back to the Haymarket, the textbooks a lot of times, like, they'll tell about the bomb, but they won't mention the reason for meeting or what happened afterwards. A lot of books even fail to mention that the fact that many of those who were tried were not even at the Haymarket meeting, but were arrested simply because they were union organizers.
Yeah. Yep. And yeah. I mean, what more can you say?
You just watched a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We're in North Alabama talking about the news for workers by workers. We're going to be on the radio on 92.5 FM, 770 AM in the Huntsville, Decatur, Athens listening area on Saturdays from 9:30 to 11 AM beginning in May. We believe that this is a really good opportunity to put new ideas in front of a conservative talk show audience. This is an audience that has never so much as heard the word union in a positive light. But we need help raising the funds to purchase the airtime. So if you could afford to send us a few bucks, you can do that by going to patreon.com/The Valley Labor Report. If you can't afford to do that, that's fine too. There are a lot of people going through some really rough times right now. So if you could just share our videos, that would be really helpful. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you.